Well, hello and good evening, and Jadith Vakarja, welcome to Telling Tales. My name isn't Matt. My name's actually Chris. So sorry about that if that's a sudden shock to anyone. You join us here on a Wednesday in the midst of the summer holidays when we are struggling to get the regular crew together to finish off our adventure in the Iron Coral for Into the Odd. So we thought we'd have a go at having a bit of a discussion about some aspects of both Into the Odd and Symbaroum. And we've framed it such that when you compare apples to oranges, you can learn a bit about fruit. A little bit more about us. We're Telling Tales. We make atmospheric tabletop role-playing games, and we stream them here, and we put the VODs up on YouTube. You can find links to both of those things, as well as our Discord below. Normally, our schedule at the minute is Monday nights is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Wednesday nights is generally Into the Odd. Is Into the Odd at the minute, but is generally our Symbaroum Throne of Thorns campaign, which is about halfway through a flipping 12-year run, or however long it's going to take us to get there. And Thursdays is usually our high concept, wonderfully executed, omnibus style World of Darkness nostalgia romp through the 5 major systems, which we call the Cincinnati Chronicles, all set on one evening on a hot 1995 summer's day in the American city of Cincinnati. Once again, links are below. Please do have a watch if you feel like we're up for that. We've got some more interesting series and news and redistribution of wealth as we come up towards the end of the summer holidays and the beginning of the autumn. But for the moment, I think what I'll do is I will bring on the other nerds who will be joining us tonight for the saying of words such as context and narrative. I'm going to first introduce Sam, who's a regular on Symbaroum. Hello, Sam.
Hello, it's me, it's Sam.
Yeah. So Sam's our we haven't used this pun for ages. Sam's our changer, our rangeling in Symbaroum, starting off as kind of a lowly rogue-esque character and turning into an absolute glass cannon. In terms of damage output in the later stages.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It has. And we're also going to bring on Stephen.
Context, narrative.
Well done. You're already 3 points ahead. We haven't even started the damn clock. Oh, damn it. Stephen is the most recent addition to the Symbaroum roster, playing a chunky sword lady, kind of fallen Templar with some serious moral boundaries issues, that one or two times at least.
Yeah, she's a product of her environment.
That is true. And that's where we're at. This is us. This is the crew for this evening. Everyone else is enjoying the lovely weather, and we are all fleeing from the burning sky orb.
This is all you get.
This is all.
Everyone else said it was a terrible idea and ran away. So
so we are actually. Thank you for joining us. We're here basically to prove Matt wrong. So if you all love this video, then we win, and that means I get to run the My Little Pony role playing game.
Like and subscribe.
Is that going to encourage people to like this video or not? That's my question.
Don't underestimate the power of the bronies. Yeah. They're out there.
Oh god. So this is. I'd like to encourage people in chat to jump in because we're going to try and go deep on some bits and pieces. That we've kind of made a list of some interesting points, and we're not really wanting to compare these two systems front to back because they're completely different, but it's the contrast between the differences which I think lets us draw some pretty interesting conclusions about intent and design, design over narrative or design under narrative, and what decisions were made then. And so we'll go through that, but the question I'd like to start with is one that was suggested here. So I'll start with you, Sam. Beneath an enchanted meadow in a small cave, you find a goblet which appears to have been carved out of an almost human-looking skull. It glows faintly and emits a steamy vapor. and you're playing Symbaroum, what do you do?
I definitely do not drink it if I'm playing Symbaric. I can't imagine anyone playing Symbaric would ever drink that. You'd have to be an absolute lunatic. In
And
Symbaric,
on that note, then, Steve, the same question, but you're playing Into the Odd. What do you do?
Well, it's free stuff, right? Like it might be an arcana, it might do cool stuff. Like coincidentally, well, partly coincidentally, mostly it's my favorite page in the whole rulebook. I have the PDF open on page 132, which is the table of I eat the stuff. So I will immediately consume the goblet. I roll a 76, which means zippy. I can move at double pace for D6 hours.
Oh, it's
Wow.
so
I've
nice.
just invented celerity.
Yeah. Oh, lovely. Yeah, so that's kind of sets the scene for why we want to compare these two systems, because I think that's just I just like it. So I wanted to kind of
it's more likely some kind of evil god is going to force you, like curse you and force you to drink this thing, as literally happened to one of our players when we found an evil looking drink. They were like possessed and forced to try and drink it.
Yeah.
I think, like no good deed goes unpunished in Symbaroum, I think, is one of the core principles of adventuring there.
Yeah, it's
and no bad deed goes unpunished either.
It's clearly an object of great power in both systems, but Symbaroum will exact a higher price for that power.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that's one of the things we were talking about when we did the kind of precursor to this, which was a more kind of an earlier look at kind of the Iron Crown, the earlier mini adventure, and we were kind of discussing that Symbaroum's magic system seems to be set up to punish you, whereas the Arcana and Into the Odd, which is kind of as close as you can get to an equivalent, are just like legitimately nice artifacts, it seems, or at least maybe more props or objects of comic relief. But there's less of a concern that they're going to come after you in the night, or their wards are going to try and do so.
A lot less. And I think that is the two, like, it's not just because Into the Odd is less punishing. It's also that Into the Odd is set up so that you care less if you get punished, because that's sort of the fun. Whereas in Symbaroum, if you get punished, you're just going to cripple your character for who knows how long, or flat out die.
Yes.
There's
something funny will happen, and that'll be that.
There is a lovely touch for the Arcana that are covered in the Into the Odd rulebook, and I think actually you could like describe artifacts in both systems this way. The minor ones are listed first under the heading powers you cannot understand. I think the sort of intermediate ones, I'm just having a look, powers you can barely control. And then the most powerful ones are labeled as legendary arcana, powers you shouldn't control.
Nice. There's such a lovely touch to the text and Into the Odd in the core book. It's just a very nice it's just very deftly written, I think. It's got one of those things that smells vaguely of Neil Gaiman. But one of the things I find really interesting about the two systems is how they conspire to tell their various stories. And I think one of the things that came up on the Symbaroum kind of the symposium recently that Free League were hosting was it was let slip seems a bit like we've discovered hidden knowledge, but it was said that the reason for Symbaroum was the reason Symbaroum exists is to tell Throne of Thorns, and Throne of Thorns exists to go through Symbaroum. So the system, the setting, and the story are all very, very closely tied together. Where I feel that Into the Odd is more of just kind of a cookbook, and I think its inclusion of random tales of random generation, which it leans on a lot, is really quite key to that. But that kind of led me to think: do we look at TTRPGs as a device to tell a story or a device to generate a story? because I think Into the Odd has all of the latter, and Symbaroum is in meta text at least declared as the former. So where do you sit on that, and do you get the same feeling that these have been kind of that Symbaroum is really kind of this tightly woven mesh, or am I underselling Into the Odd a bit?
I kind of think that Symbaroum, although I think the campaign that we're playing through is really nice and does go well with sort of slowly revealing the lore of Symbaroum, I do think that Symbaroum is also quite well set up to tell your own stories, because it's just like this unknown forest with literal dungeons or tombs in it. And you can come up with whatever you want if that's what you would rather do in Symbaroum. I think you could still do that. I think it's still a very reasonable option for Symbaroum, and that Symbaroum, like, actually as a system, is almost quite well suited to doing that, because in the world of Symbaroum, people don't know what is in Davokar. So you can basically just come up with whatever you like, put it anywhere on the map that doesn't already have a thing, and say this is in the forest of Davokar, and your party's going out to explore it. So I think Symbaroum definitely can still do that, but I would agree that, like, the campaign is it's something you should. The campaign of Symbaroum is something that you should play at some point if you're playing a lot of Symbaroum, even if you mix in your own stuff a little bit. But Into the Odd, I think you just do whatever you want. I don't think there's much lore that's supposed to be revealed in Into the Odd.
Yeah, certainly the Iron Coral, in like contrast to the Throne of Thorns campaign, feels to me a lot like not so much a narrative that has been kind of constructed and kind of has a beginning, a middle, end, and character arcs and all of these things. It feels like I haven't really delved very deeply into the kind of the tables at the back of the book that the game clearly relies on when you're not running the Iron Coral, but it feels like the Iron Coral probably draws a lot from those tables, right? Like you could almost recreate that, with dice rolls and tables. Like I guess to answer your question about, are TTRPGs like ways to tell stories or ways to generate stories? I think the answer is probably somewhere in between, because to me, the process of like playing a TTRPG is essentially collaborative storytelling, right? And so it's what's the word I'm looking for? You don't know because I haven't said it. It's like asymmetric, in the sense that you have there is one GM and there are players, and there's a kind of a different relationship there, but like everybody's working together to tell the story. And I think it's just a question of like to what extent are we following predetermined paths set by the GM. But like the thing that fascinated me about Into the Odd, particularly as a palate cleanser for a longer campaign for Symbaroum, like one of the things that jumped out to me immediately was there's something built into the character of people from Bastion that shares a similarity with things that are built into the character of Ambrians in Symbaroum, right? Like both have this kind of slightly imperialist mindset that like what's out there in the world, in Davokar or in the Odd, is unknown and is there to be like explored and exploited. And I think that drive is built into both games to sort of propel you into the story. And I was just intrigued by the idea of essentially running an Into the Odd campaign set in Davokar. I think it would have a wildly different tone to Symbaroum, right? But mechanically, I think it would work. Yeah. You could do a randomly generated forest hex crawl with dungeons and dangers and all of this stuff. I think it would come down to how the player characters respond to that tonally. I've rambled on a bunch of different points there. Sorry.
One of the things that's kind of that has me a little bit interested in both games, and you're right, they both have this "here be dragons" painted on the map, and also dragons are worth money. Now go find the dragons kind of conceit. But I think I have it down here on my notes as Into the Odd has a kind of a show but don't tell approach, in that it lays all this cryptic, layered, kind of almost hyper-dimensional space of the odd that transcends kind of mapping, and it kind of lays it in front of you and goes, here, go have fun. And Symbaroum is much more of a kind of hide and reveal approach. And one of the things I say that it's perfectly systemically, it's perfectly possible to play Symbaroum not following the core rules, and it's not following the Throne of Thorns campaign. But so much of what we've been through as us, personally, all of us as a group, has been each kind of incremental step we take along to uncover the plots, is uncovering the setting. The setting is the story. So the more we learn about Davokar, the more we learn about how these structures work, that literally a month ago in the VODs, we were completely mystified by their enigmatic means. And then a little further on, they're kind of like, oh yes, they're in charge of looking after this. They're trying to stop corruption. Whereas in Into the Odds, I think all of the reveals of what these things are not based on what the characters know, but based more on kind of a wink to the fourth wall that says, "Oh, this is actually a spaceship, and it's a spaceship that's just fallen out of a Douglas Adams short story, and here is the absurd and funniness that you can find there."
I think both of the settings play quite heavily on this. This possibility of having encounters with the unknowable, for want of a better way to put it. But I'm absolutely certain there are things in Davokar that would remain like completely inscrutable to player parties. But certainly everything that we've experienced so far, there has been like an underpinning, like everything has had a reason, a
cosmology, I suppose.
Yeah. People have motivations and relationships with each others, and like there is a particular kind of structure to how the magic works. There is.
And I think maybe to be even more concise about it, Symbaroum is about the unknown, but Into the Odd is about the unknowable.
That's a very good distinction. Yeah,
I think at least in Symbaroum, it's like things that are. There's a lot of things which are unknown to the players, but which the DM should know and, has to know. Whereas Into the Odd, it feels like no one's really, even the DM is not really supposed to know what is about to happen in Into the Odd or what you're going to find in Into the Odd. Or at least, like, if you were to run a campaign of Into the Odd that wasn't in the book, that I feel like a DM would not have to be particularly careful in terms of, like, the lore, like, overwriting or, ignoring any of the lore that exists for Into the Odd. Whereas in Symbaroum, if you were to run something not from the book, I feel like it would be a lot more of an effort to keep it within the already existing lore of what is actually, contained in the text of the various Symbaroum books,
Yeah, and I wonder, is that a factor of kind of just the amount of material that's available already for Symbaroum versus Into the Odd with its kind of slightly more kind of old school legacy? I want to bring up this comment. I'm going to break with tradition. I'm going to try and do comments as we come across them, because I kind of want to talk to this point as well. And we've not seen Dark Davokar yet. And while that's true, I also kind of feel that once we go into Dark Davokar, we have a cosmology in our heads about how the structures of the societies that operate there work, and we're approaching forewarned. And I think Into the Odd would have a very, very different, much more chaotic, I suppose, feeling about kind of going somewhere even odder. Like a great example is when we came across the spoilers for Iron Coral, when we came across the Bastion subway station in the Iron Coral. That was a great moment of it's just gone into the odder, and like I think that's something real valuable, and I think that's something that Symbaroum equips you with a cosmology that lets you rationalize what's going on within the framework of the games. Into the Odd is hanging on by a thread and has a manic grin on its face and a sharpened cleaver in its hand and is gesturing wildly at the thread. It feels like anything can happen in Into the Odd, and only bad things can happen in Symbaroum, and we've got a good idea of what those things might be. I don't know. Do we agree? And what do you feel about kind of? I don't. Do you feel that something fundamentally different in tone could exist in Dark Davokar? I suppose. And I'm leading the question, and I apologize because I don't think there is.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think the point of Into the Odd is to surprise you with what you find in the new places that you go, and whether that's from the book or from the DM, but that you'll go somewhere and you'll just find things that you couldn't possibly be prepared for, or couldn't possibly, expect. Whereas in Symbaroum, it's more like you go to a new place and you don't know what is going to be there, but you would expect that whatever you find there is going to fit in with the other things you already know and kind of give you a sense of this thing that I've found that's new makes other things make sense. Whereas Into the Odd, it's like you're going to find something that is completely in isolation from the rest of the world of Into the Odd, and it's just going to be a complete surprise, a complete shock. And that's sort of the joy of it, that it doesn't have to make any real sense. It's just a kind of a funny, fun, interesting thing that you're going to find that isn't tied down by the constraints of fitting in with a very tightly constructed world. It's just whatever's there is there.
And this leads really nicely on to kind of the next kind of marquee point I wanted to bring up about the scale of these systems and their settings. And I don't know where exactly these systems fit on these scales, and perhaps you can help me here. But it seems like we have seen throughout the two systems, there is a micro scale within a single scene where there is detail, and there is a self-contained set of actions and a self-contained set of outcomes. There is a kind of macro adventure, which is sort of a single landscape, like the area around the Tomb of Dying Dreams from the end of the Copper Crown is an example of that. And then, of course, there's the epic adventure, the hero's journey, the still somewhat obscure mist of the actors and requirements of the full Throne of Thorns that we're coming up to. But I think that the games kind of have to, especially games like this that are kind of focusing on a narrative, have to skew themselves towards the epic, and games that are focusing on just being a story generation engine kind of have to focus on the micro. And so do you agree with me on that, or do you feel that there's some kind of there's some shortcuts that could be taken?
I unmuted before I had a thought fully formed in my head. I guess those things sort of drive me towards like some schools of thought around, to take it away from TTRPG a bit and into, I don't know, video game world. You have certain types of games that are like very heavily story driven. They tend to be big budget games, largely because constructing those kind of narratives and the ways through them can be just very expensive in terms of cutscenes and dialogue and all of this stuff. And then you have other sort of more sandboxy, more like procedurally generated games, like a Minecraft or a No Man's Sky or something, where there's kind of like a lot of its exploration, seeing what you see in those kind of games. And there may be like vignettes, there may be like hints of stories, and I found this abandoned space station and like, this happened, or I rode a pig off a cliff, or whatever it is you do in Minecraft these days. But the procedural nature of the systems in those games make it very, very difficult to construct larger scale macro narratives, right? You can, like, unless you kind of tack them on, and like, yeah, Into the Odd is, undoubtedly a procedural system in the sense that outside of the Iron Coral, it is almost entirely built around tables. I'd kind of like to see some more written adventures for Into the Odd. I guess maybe like Electric Bastion Land does that. I'm not sure whether that game has more kind of structured pre-generated content or not, but yeah, I think like your observation that the scale of narratives is different in the different games is I think a symptom of the choices of the authors of those systems about how heavily narrative driven they're going to be.
I think that's such a good analogy of how the games are. Like one feels Into the Odd does feel like kind of a procedurally generated video game as a tabletop RPG, and Symbaroum feels like, at least the way we've played Symbaroum is just a story driven game. But I do think you could play Symbaroum a bit more in the kind of procedurally generated fashion if you didn't want to go down the route of playing through the campaign. I do think there's a path there to go into Davokar, see what you find. It's going to be whatever the GM has cooked up this week. He's going to have some new dungeon, some new tomb for you to find, and like I think you could do that, but definitely the way we have played Symbaroum is a lot more focus on the macro narrative of the whole system and the story that they've written to go along with it.
Yeah. Chris said right from the outset of this that this is going to be an exercise in comparing apples to oranges, but I think that is particularly the case where we're comparing the Throne of Thorns campaign with so like the Iron Coral, I guess, it is a pre-written adventure. But I think we're kind of almost thinking about that as an example of the other kinds of things that could happen in Into the Odd. I'm slightly like I'm fascinated with parts of the rule book for Into the Odd that hint at the possibility of much bigger macro adventures. I cannot imagine how they work, but beyond what we're playing, there is this idea that you can go out on adventures, you can come back with treasures, you can use that to build wealth. You can use that. There are rules for investing in businesses, growing a business empire, growing perhaps some kind of military industrial complex. There are rules for armies. I would love to know how that plays out. It feels like you would have to go on a lot of adventures and you would have to spend a very long time kind of building up those sorts of character arcs to be able to achieve that that epic scale.
Yeah. I really wonder how it would be different kind of tonally if that was what you were doing in Into the Odd, because I feel like where we have played Into the Odd, I'm not going to say we don't care if we die, but I think we're willing to die in service of doing what is fun and interesting.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Whereas if you were playing a much longer campaign, I have to imagine your attitude would be different. Like you would be much more cautious, and maybe it would be tonally. I don't imagine it could ever reach like Symbaroum levels of caution about what you encounter in the world, but I have to think that it would head in that direction at the very least.
Yeah, like if you've got something to lose in a character, then you're, I think, going to naturally approach situations much more cautiously.
So what's interesting and kind of a point of rules here is that Symbaroum kind of, I believe it itself used the phrase roguelike or roguelite, in that when you die as a character in Symbaroum, you roll up a new character, but with the total XP of the character you've had a point. So I feel like what attaches you to your characters in Symbaroum is the narrative, is not just the story, but your position as a tradition bearer, an agency bearer within that story, and that's something I think is a really neat approach to underplay getting kicked back to level 1, but still give. It's just interesting how we still end up being so risk averse in that system, and I agree that's definitely a pattern we have. Kind of a thought, two thoughts I wanted to kind of carry into the next section. There feels to me in Into the Odd, with all of these kind of, I don't want to say ancillary systems, because we have a habit here of playing short run games, and we have a habit of trying to wrap things up. We don't run things. The only thing we're running that's lasting a span of years is our Symbaroum campaign. Everything else is kind of has an end point, and I feel like Into the Odd is built to allow that campaign of years to develop in a kind of this more open space. But my key there is, it feels with all of these extra objects, with all of this kind of weirdness, with the oddities in Into the Odd, like there's a certain nostalgia to the very earliest moments of TTRPGs, to the 70s and the early 80s, where there was a lot more abstractness to the worlds that you were inhabiting, and much less kind of much less of being dragged into the space. And I think one of the key symptoms, and I don't want to talk about this now, I want to talk about it later, is whatever happened to all the hex crawlers, because that's a whole system of play that's I have first experienced Into the Odd and haven't really touched beforehand. Kind of the other thought I wanted to drag in here is I've lost it. This is so unprofessional. Yeah, so I think there is. Oh yes, that was it actually. So Into the Odd, and this is one thing I think that Into the Odd does exceptionally well, that Symbaroum wishes it could do as well. And it goes back, Stephen, to what you were saying about these games like Minecraft and these TTRPGs. And it comes down to the fact that there is a loose associated narrative. You find abandoned, ruined nether portals in Minecraft, and you wonder about the civilization, but you're never told. You're shown. Going back to what I was saying earlier, where Into the Odd is very much here is a thing, draw your own conclusions of what about it's here. And I think in the Iron Coral, we have seen a lot of stuff that alludes to a meta plot, alludes to entities working with agency in the landscape, but just never gives us enough information to move ahead with that. Whereas Symbaroum, we would come across these enigmas and these confusing moments and these mysteries, but we would, I think, in our hearts understand that this is the story and there is going to be an end to this story, and these loose ends will tie themselves up if we apply ourselves to it. I don't think Into the Odd gives you that safety net of closure.
Well, okay. I sort of take your point, but I'm also going to play devil's advocate. Like, I don't think there is necessarily a need or a requirement for Symbaroum to tie up its loose ends and mysteries. I think that viewpoint might come slightly from the fact that the Wrath of the Warden campaign that we've just played, like that did feel like that played out like a detective story, right? A thing has happened, find out the parties that were involved, find out what they're trying to do, where the factions are, what they're trying to achieve, gather information, build this mental model of the events in and around Thistlehold. Like, if we went into Davokar and saw and experienced crazy things, and there was never a point later in the story where that crazy thing that we saw really had an explanation or a framework, I think that would be okay. Like, I don't think the game would fall down for lack of exposition. I think it's also presumably entirely possible in Into the Odd to construct a meta narrative that that does explain some things about the world. Like, so one thing. Sorry, Sam, I'm just going to ramble for a bit.
That's fine
like,
by me. I'm interested to hear.
One thing that sort of sprang to my mind, Chris, when you were talking about kind of old school hex crawlers, like the thing that immediately springs to mind there is like Dungeons and Dragons, because that was kind of originally born out of like a wargaming tradition, right? Like it was, and I think to this day is, I think comparatively unusual amongst like TTRPGs in that like the way that it's played a lot of the time is still kind of figures moving through a space. There's a physical representation to a lot of RPGs that harks back to that hex crawl, I think. The other thing I think Into the Odd shares with Dungeons and Dragons as a kind of as a setting and as a framework for allowing things to happen is that so the odd is not well explained in the rulebook, and that's clearly a deliberate choice, right? Because you can either just choose to have that be unexplained, or I guess you can have a GM that would try to kind of add some layer of meta narrative over that if they wanted to. You know, like what's going on with these aliens? Like, why is it so weird out there? Like, are there sentient beings in control of this? Is this some kind of weird Cthulhu-esque dimensional rift? Like, I don't know, but like it leaves the possibility open for any of those kind of those things, right? In the same way that I'm talking more about older editions of Dungeons and Dragons and the kind of core books. Like I'm sure there are supplements that go into great detail over settings or potential settings, but the core rule book is like, you know, it's a fantasy world. You could do anything you want. We're leaving it open to the GM as to the specific world that your characters are going to inhabit, you know, the parameters of that. But just to get you started, like, here's some combat rules, here's some stuff about, you know, some sample maps of dungeons, here's a bestiary, you know, a monster manual. And from that, you kind of go, right, this is a game where I could do anything in a fantasy world, but it's mostly about exploring dungeons and having fights with monsters and getting treasure, I guess, because that's kind of where the rules cluster around.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess the point that I'm trying to get about that kind of old school sensibility is, I think, that both D&D and Into the Odd are open in setting and provide rules that give you like a framework to allow certain kinds of things to happen, and just lets you shape the game from there. You know, and Symbaroum's different, isn't it?
It is. And I think
it's a much more, you know, it's constrained.
One of the kind of contrasts that sprung to me when thinking about, because some points were raised there about kind of how you would implement some of Into the Odd, or the feeling of Into the Odd and Symbaroum. And I think one of the feelings I get from Into the Odd that I don't get from Symbaroum is one of emptiness and loneliness. And Symbaroum always feels kind of clustered and dense and busy. It evokes the forest that it so often puts you into. Whereas the Odd, I think from what I've been feeling about it, it is this misty marsh. It is this open plain. You can see the next 6 hexes, but you can see the horizon, and you can kind of notice things by their abnormality. So in the distance, there is a structure. Whereas in Davokar, it's in the distance there is a physical and a metaphorical structure. Whereas in Davokar, if you were to throw something kind of unexplained in there, or if you were to give a subtle hint, you can fail to see the wood for the trees in Davokar and in Symbaroum. And I think that's something that maybe locks Symbaroum out of some of the feeling of Into the Odd. Some, I suppose, a bit of the majesty that Into the Odds can get, the kind of chaotic gremlin majesty.
It's kind of interesting, like this, what you've just said in like the last question you gave. I think for me, like that feeling of kind of emptiness and loneliness. To me, it, at least when I'm playing, it kind of puts a bit more pressure on my suspension of disbelief when I'm playing Into the Odd, because I feel like my character would know more about the world than they do. Because it's hard for me to believe that someone living in the world of Into the Odd would be so unaware of anything in their world as I am, and yet, like, I kind of feel like that's how your character is supposed to be. Like, you're not supposed to know anything about anything outside of this one city. And to me, I you know it I wouldn't say it takes me out of the world, but Symbaroum being the opposite draws me into the world, in that I feel like my character knows things about the world, has knowledge that they've gained over their lifetime, that kind of their knowledge of the world fleshes them out as a character. Their opinions on random things and factions and peoples in that world adds to their character. And Into the Odd sort of, to me, lacks that. You can't base your character on how they feel about things in the world, because they don't know anything about the world. All they know is, like, they're a coal miner from Bastion. There's nothing else to the world to, like, place your character in reference to. And it's a very different feeling. I think personally I prefer Symbaroum for that reason, because I find it easier to flesh my character out and how they would think about things and react to things, because I can place them in relation to the rest of the world a lot easier than in Into the Odd.
No, very good point. So there's a couple. There's another great point here by 42 that popped up here. The Into the Odd campaign would be a lot like Alice in Wonderland, and I think that's a really good kind of encapsulates a lot what kind of Into the Odd feels like, because it does feel like moment to moment you're faced with crisis after crisis after crisis. Yet your path through this world is rambling and kind of, and honestly, okay, I haven't read the book, but I've watched the Disney movie, so I'm qualified to speak about Alice in Wonderland. It feels like there is crisis after crisis after crisis that Alice overcomes in a world where that does not matter. In a world where it is just a very winding path that you must follow towards the outcome of the adventure. And I feel like that kind of sums up kind of Into the Odd to me. Maybe it sums up Hex Crawlers as well, but that's definitely the feeling I get from it. And it also kind of highlights the aspect of surrealism. And like, I think it's important to understand that when we look at Into the Odd, we're looking at a system that enjoys its surrealism. And when we look at Symbaroum, we're looking at a system that doesn't really have any. Do you guys feel that Symbaroum's kind of not, that Symbaroum's a very grounded system, and Into the Odd feels a lot separate from that?
Yeah, Symbaroum's gritty as hell, isn't it? Symbaroum is like, you know, I don't know. I suppose it's really hard to kind of talk about like fantasy settings with Symbaroum and not like draw a comparison to like George R.R. Martin or something. But you know, like the revelation of Game of Thrones was this idea of, you have a fantasy world, like there are dragons, there is some degree of magic, but like, this ain't Tolkien. This is about people and about motivation and about power and about, you know, violence. And it's like an unpleasant place to be, populated largely with unpleasant people. You know, it's I guess grimdark is the subgenre.
Yeah, I suppose it also goes back to how you opened, that both Symbaroum and Into the Odd have. In Symbaroum, you've got this really weird and slightly problematic dichotomy of the Ambrians coming over the mountains, both as colonists and as refugees.
Yeah, I love that. I love that as a central conceit.
I did manage to collar your man on the symposium, and it was absolutely deliberate that they wanted to kind of deconstruct both these concepts and get us to think about both these concepts in the framework of Davokar. I think Into the Odd does something similar. And one thing kind of Sam was talking earlier about being taken out of the immersion there. I think there's a certain, because in Into the Odd, you really are nothing but colonists. You're not fleeing any great trauma. But on the other hand, there's a certain historical accuracy to being someone who has lived their life in an urban area and having no exposure to the outside world and having no framework for understanding the outside world and coming to look at that. Imagine kind of a very early tourist going to India, or a very early tourist going to Moscow, or something like that. I think Into the Odd, Symbaroum doesn't do culture shock very well. I think Into the Odd has culture shock woven into it, I feel. Even if there isn't much of a culture to be shocked by, there's certainly a lot of shock to be cultured by.
I think the extent to which it's possible to agree with that statement probably depends quite heavily on how much we managed to encounter some of the cultures in Davokar.
Yeah.
I can't say from an actual play, but I can say from going through the rule book, there's definitely some things about kind of barbarians and about like other types of peoples and civilizations inside Davokar. Elves, for sure, are like super alien. So I disagree.
That's Sam, of course. The relationship in Symbaroum, at least, the relationship between the elves is kind of one of Askarai's driving doodads, one of your kind of MacGuffins. So I think you should really have a comment on this as well. How do you feel about this kind of other and othering and trifecta othering in Davokar?
I think that's like, it also plays in really with what I was talking about before, where like Into the Odds, elves could exist and you just wouldn't even know it. And so it wouldn't be possible to have a character like Askarai, who I think his relationship, his thoughts about the elves are kind of a key part of his identity, and something that I think about, when I'm trying to think of him as a character, something which helps me to kind of get into how would you feel if you're sort of abandoned by this group of people, but the group of people you're abandoned to also kind of don't like you as a race. And like, I think in Into the Odd, that character couldn't exist. And I kind of get what you mean about, the culture shock can be a little bit more on Into the Odd, because the cultures can be so out there. But at the same time, I kind of feel like it misses the element of the cultures being known about. You just sort of stumble into a culture, and it's like, it's not as though you're going to go in to this place or to this people with misconceptions of how they are, and then learn the reality by being there. You're going to encounter this group of people that your character's never heard of, no one you've ever met has ever heard of, and you're just going to learn what this culture is and what it does. And I feel like in that way, Symbaroum is kind of a more powerful message in terms of culture shock and encountering new cultures and colonialism, because you get the sort of, these are the rumors we hear about the elves. These are the rumors people think about barbarians and about the forest and things like that. And then you encounter the reality and you see the difference there. And that is a large part of, learning about colonialism and that kind of thing. Whereas in Into the Odd, it's just like, you show up and you learn how things actually are, because there's no knowledge of anything that you're about to encounter in Into the Odd. You just encounter it, kind of.
Yeah, that's all great points. I kind of want to move on to the next kind of marquee section of the evening, kind of pump the oxygen out of the room and replace it with an ideal frictionless gas, and maybe talk a little bit more about the systems involved here. And again, I go back to kind of the hexagonal elephant in the room I really wanted to talk about. And we talked about kind of hex crawling coming from kind of from the dawn of time in terms of D&D. I also kind of think that model-based TTRPGs or physical analog TTRPGs are very much something that we don't do very much in this in this part of the world, which has done an awful lot across the Atlantic. And I have either of you played like legitimate, these kind of what feels to be legitimate and ancient hex crawlers before, and how did you find that previous experience versus Into the Odd? And can you even name another hex crawler?
No.
Me neither.
So this is weird. I wonder, is this imagined authenticity then? Because I feel like there is a body of very early TTRPGs or very early, even tabletop games, even like, I don't know, the Adventures and Settlers of Catan, kind of some kind of game where this is explored a bit more.
Like hexes in board games is a well-established, and war games is a well-established trope. Like and I guess the idea of miniatures moving around a map is not unique to D&D. So like those things exist. I wonder how much a hex crawling RPG is a thing that, you know, like occupied a significant part of the RPG landscape once upon a time, and how much of it's kind of like an imagined sort of nostalgia. I mean, so you know, I saw in the notes before we had this chat that these were things that you were wanting to talk about, and that there was a you know, for you, a kind of a 70s vibe to Into the Odd. I looked it up, and both Into the Odd and Symbaroum were published in the same year. They're both 2014, which is an interesting kind of, you know. So there we've got a comparatively recent year in which the hobby was kind of
one, though, because isn't it? It has a weird timeline in that it is a sequel to a prequel, which is also a sequel, and that it actually stretches back a little bit further than that. Because I think there's Bastion Lands.
I thought Into the Odd was first. I could be
no. Into the Odd was first, then Bastion Land, then Into the Odd 2015, which is the re-release, which is us.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of how my research kind of bore this out, but that's sort of my feeling. And just to kind of maybe to prove my point here, we got a thing here. You can play Symbaroum with Davokar-based hex maps, which is that makes me feel a bit weird.
But it's like, it makes absolute sense that you can, though, right? Because Davokar is like, you know, you have an area that you're exploring. You know, like a hex map is just a way to arrange space, right?
I'm not sure if this is the case, but I almost feel like Matt at some point has rolled us random Davokar encounters, which you could easily just apply to, like, I'm pretty sure there are random Davokar encounters, and you can just be like, we're going through a hex, here's a random encounter or no random encounter, and there's no real reason not to. I'm curious because I don't know how many old systems had hex scrolls. Was it, I don't know if you guys know, like, was it that common in the past?
So maybe this is, as Steve pointed out, some kind of imagined authenticity, imagined nostalgia for something that doesn't exist. And like I said, the other thing that kind of came to me that made me feel that is the breadth of the systems within Into the Odd for like investments and armies that don't really seem to gel with Into the Odd's kind of micro moment to moments mechanisms. And I don't know, Steve, I think you've done a bit more reading into those than we have. How did you feel systemically that they kind of did you feel there was a conflict between how Into the Odd seems to want to run very encounter-based objectives, whereas there's a lot of systems that are kind of more temporal objectives, like buy a house or own an army or
I'm not sure that I know how to answer that one, to be honest. Like, it's a very kind of generalized point, but I think that any game is, you know, like, there is some degree of setting, there is some degree of rules constructions that allows or encourages certain things to happen in that setting. and then the experience of playing that emerges from those two things, right? So there's nothing in Into the Odd that says that you have to have characters that are like incredibly gung-ho and that we have to go and have an adventure quite as silly as we have been having. I think we've had an adventure that silly partly because like some of that's the setting, like some very strange things happen, but the response to those, I think, is partly that we have a player group that was actually just felt like having a nice tonal change from Symbaroum, but also partly that felt like, although that wasn't explicitly stated in the rulebook, it was encouraged by the tone in the rulebook, right? It's very breezy, like it's very fast. It's you know, you get a couple of pages in and it's just like roll whatever it is, 3d6, write that number down. That's your strength. Roll 3d6. That's your your willpower. Like it's a handful of dice rolls. You can roll up a character in 5 minutes with no thought. And that's kind of how it starts, like almost all it says about Bastion is that it's the only city that matters. Like all that it really says about the Odd is that it's everywhere else, and people tried to map it and they couldn't because it's weird. Like there's a few examples of play where you sort of see players move into a room, the GM describes the thing that they see, they immediately start kind of like problem solving and figuring out how to get past this thing to the kind of next encounter. And all of these things kind of set a tone in the same way. I think I forget exactly how the Symbaroum rulebook starts, but I'm fairly sure it's like a sort of a potted history of the arrival in Ambria and the kind of I think it talks about, and then sort of segues into like some of the geography and politics of the place. And I think you're quite deep into it. You've been certainly immersed in a lot of the artwork before you get as far as character creation.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So you kind of get the feel early on.
Yeah, like the rule books, and not just the rules, but like the way that they're written, the way that they're presented, the copywriting, the graphic design and layout of the rule books as like physical objects, like has a huge impact on the tones, the tone of a game. And I think both of these games do excellent jobs at communicating that tone without having to explain like, this is what we're going for, this is how we want you to play our game.
I find it very interesting that we both of these games, I think, I mean, this is a real cursed word in the TTRPG discourse, but I think both of these games are rules light. They certainly kind of have their rule set is a number of pages, and then extensions to that rule set are based on skills. At least that's the case with Symbaroum. I think with Into the Odd, the extensions to the rules happen with the Arcana. I just feel that we have managed to break or at least put Symbaroum into positions where it has stopped working very well, and we've had to kind of muddle our way backwards out of the system to get it to where we've all just had to agree as a group that this is the way it works and we're passing forward with it. We have not yet managed to put Into the Odd into that same situation, and I think maybe is it fair to say that Into the Odd is much more cut down than Symbaroum, at least in terms of the roll to roll mechanics?
I think so. I think the reason we don't run into that kind of thing in Into the Odd is just because there's way less systems, way less things that kind of interact with each other when you're playing. I mean, to hit someone, you literally just roll to see how much damage you do to them. Like, that's it. They don't roll their armor. You don't roll to see if you hit them or like any extra damage or any extra abilities. It's literally just like, this is how much, like, your stats don't even come into it. You just roll whatever weapon you have, and that's how much damage gets done to them.
such a good point that you go from kind of a 3 or 4 step in Symbaroum kind of stack of effects to resolve damage down to just basically one, and yet still it's kind of very satisfying.
Yeah, and I just think in Symbaroum is like, it is quite rules light, but there's still enough in there that things can kind of interact in ways that are not intuitive or that go slightly wrong. And maybe at times we've not perfectly understood things. And sometimes that's the fault of the sort of slightly strange translation of parts of the rule book and, the wording of certain things. But I just think even Symbaroum being stripped down, it doesn't compare to the stripped downness of Into the Odd. Like, there's really straightforward mechanics in Into the Odd that you can't really get wrong and don't feel like they can really mess each other up. Maybe with more Arcana involved, it could get complicated.
Yeah, even the Arcana are quite constrained though. Like they have, some of these have like very potentially very powerful effects that will be kind of described, but then will list caveats to that, like things that these Arcana can't do. Which I think is probably stuff that came out of playtesting.
Yeah, I was about
just
to comment.
If the designer kind of like just thinking like how a player is going to abuse this.
The question that kind of leads me right on to is would Symbaroum benefit from? Would it feel the same? Would it be better if we just got rid of a couple of rules or got rid of a couple of steps in these encounter situations?
I mean that's a game balancing question that's very difficult to answer without a lot of playtesting. So like anything that I give could be wildly inaccurate in play. I feel like the rules for flanking and advantage in Symbaroum, like maybe we wouldn't. Well, like now we'd miss them if they were gone because we're used to them. But I think that could be potentially sort of stripped back. I think some of the skills that you and I have, Chris, in the game, where as soon as you sort of step into a gauge, you get a free attack, and then you can kind of push them back and they re-engage and you get another free attack and then you get a bonus and that maybe gives you an attack and then it's your actual attack, and it's like keeping track of some of those things as the skills build up can get complex. Like I don't think it's anything like as rough as pick a World of Darkness game or D&D,
exactly.
or like there are a number of other tabletop games that are way more complex in terms of combat. But like, yeah, so
sure. Couple of good kind of colliery points from the floor with regard to Symbaroum. Keeping fights interesting, even in the early and mid game, for us has been very, very difficult. Specifically with just combats going in loops with no way to break the chain. Just with in certain circumstances where someone is bad at hitting and someone is good at defending, it just kind of goes in what seems to be an unbroken loop. And I suppose to kind of maybe a really great point here is do we like Symbaroum more for the story? I think we absolutely do, because I feel like sometimes when we announce combat in Symbaroum, there's almost a bit of a, oh no, here we go.
I do like the combat in Symbaroum, but I do think it's kind of, as you said, we run into certain situations where the combat doesn't work as it should. Like I feel like the combat is designed around it being like very quick, very deadly. And sometimes for whatever reason, I don't know if it's the abilities we have or the enemies we face, that just hasn't played out. Like it hasn't played out that it's been quick and deadly. It's played out that we've been like rolling and doing like 1 damage or no damage like 5 turns in a row, and it's just like the only thing that's happening is us rolling dice and nothing, with no result. And that's never going to be like an interesting
Satisfying,
combat. Like that's
it's
just
sort of
can't possibly be.
swingy and unpredictable, right? Like some like we've absolutely you Sam in particular have like one-shotted bosses, and then also we've just had like huge slogfests with what should have been, you know, like a sort of a motley band of minions.
Is this a factor? Could this possibly be a factor of the range of the randomization? Because obviously Symbaroum is based on D20, so you've got a 1 to 20, and Into the Odd is based on a 1 to 12. If you cut down the instances, I think Into the Odd's 2d6, yeah?
Have you been rolling 2d6?
Oh, God. Whatever Into the Odd is, it has been about 4 months since we've last played it, so I've kind of forgotten the rules a bit. But whatever, it's definitely a smaller pool of numbers, is it not?
No, maybe marginally. No. Well, just no. Like so the stats at Into the Odd are it's the range between 1 and 20. Well, between 3 and 18.
Yeah,
because you get them by rolling 3d6, but then in play you're just trying to roll a d20 at that number or less, which is basically exactly the same.
That's true, actually.
As Symbaroum.
The thing is, that is not combat though. In combat, you just roll what your weapon is, right? Like whatever
points, you just roll your D8 or your D4.
Yeah, like that's all you do.
It's the first system that I've played where you don't have to roll to hit, and it was a bit of a revelation to me.
It was,
it's not fun, is it? To get your cool spear or your amazing bow or whatever and be like, yeah, I'm gonna do like some heroic combat shit now, and fail, just like, oh, and then you miss. I'll just wait till next round then. Yes, there's got to be the possibility of failure, but like I've never found that fun. The other thing that Into the Odd sort of stands out for there is that there's no rolling for like perception to see things, and I love that. I love just like if there's something in the environment to see, you can see it.
That's actually a really good point. That was one of our items to talk about as well. Would Into the Odd benefit from a perception mechanism? Sam, you are the perception monster in Symbaroum. Did you miss it in Into the Odd?
I didn't miss perception, but I think Into the Odd, this goes for combat and perception.
It's going to pause there because I didn't miss perception is one of the most awful sentences I've had to hear for like a month.
I didn't miss rolling perception, maybe. But I think for the campaign we're playing in Into the Odd, it's quite nice. You know, the combat rolling where you just roll your weapon and the not having to roll perception. But I think in a longer campaign, it's kind of nice to have those ways to differentiate your character and to build your character up. Like in Into the Odd, if I find a gun or a sword, I'm just as good at my character is going to be just as good at using that as any other character. And it makes kind of all the characters. There's a situation if you play a long campaign of Into the Odd, you're going to end up all having like very similar sets of items and weapons that are just like, these have the highest dice rolls. This is what I'm going to do every combat. I'm going to shoot them with my gun that is a D10 or, whatever it is. Whereas in a longer campaign, it's nice that in Symbaroum, we all the characters have their little niche, their thing that they do well. I think that's a fun part of, having kind of a group dynamic. Even like, Mike with his healing and his spells is something that none of us really do. And, it's nice to just have ways in a longer campaign to be able to differentiate your character with those kind of different roles. And in Into the Odd, I don't miss it, but in a longer campaign, I might start to miss it.
That's a really good point, because there really is no role-based specialization in Into the Odd. I kind of feel like it's not something that's missing. Neither of these two systems are deficient in any way, but I feel there is a nice feeling to know that while the party in Symbaroum is not min-maxed, everyone does have a certain role. There is the holy trinity of the tank, the healer, and the ranged DPS. Into the Odd somewhat spared that, maybe because Into the Odd's perhaps even more so than Symbaroum, the combat isn't really the end. And one of the things that I think when we started off Into the Odd, I didn't know what I was getting into. I'd spent a little bit reading the book, but I think it was pretty clear that first off, when we were rolling the characters, it became apparent that the character generation itself was pulling us into this Douglas Adams Python-esque space. And then once we arrived kind of at the beginning of the scenario proper, at the beginning of the hex crawl, the good afternoon effect, the good morning effect, where we solved a lot of our encounters without resorting to any kind of violence. And I found that very, very interesting, because we solved those encounters really without rolling anything, without resorting to the roll and role play. It's so weird to have a game so stripped back that you can, in some circumstances, remove the randomness intrinsic to role-playing games from it and still get a good experience. And I'm not too sure how Into the Odd gets away with it and creates such a satisfying experience off the back of it. Did you feel that, especially our approach to these encounters in the early game, did it feel as satisfying to you as it did to me?
I did like it, and actually, one thing that I'd really like to, I don't know if I'd really like, but I think it would be interesting to have in Symbaroum is the willpower first impression role on meeting people, because I think that played a huge part in Into the Odd, and it only added good things. And on the opposite end, in Symbaroum, is this that persuasion or something like that? Feels to me like by far the most underutilized stat in Symbaroum by miles, other than maybe accuracy. But like, it's just I think that played a big part in, like, that role in Into the Odd played a big part in why those encounters felt nice, because it wasn't just like you meet someone and then like, or something, and then the DM kind of plays it as, a neutral reaction to you, or that they immediately hate you. It's like there's already kind of two paths that you can go down just based off a role that add, a bit of life to the encounter immediately.
Yeah. And I think the rule book's fairly clear on the fact that like the GM doesn't have to, like, just because you pass or fail a willpower roll doesn't mean that the encounter has to go the way that the dice dictate. Like, the GM's got some agency there, but I think wherever Matt felt that he was able to run with it, he did run with it. And I agree, like that would be an incredible thing to have in Symbaroum. You kind of, you come out into a forest clearing and there's, there is a tribe of elves there, and there's just, you have that moment of kind of like, how is this going to go? Like that sort of like that sense, I guess, that sense of first contact, right?
Yeah, exactly. I also feel that kind of stepping back to this kind of the way we got through encounters and the way it did very rarely lead to violence. And one good comment here about the Arcana is that it's really interesting to see the Arcana do not always impact the Arcana, like, they're not extra dice for damage in most cases. They're extra events that you can negotiate with the storyteller. And I think that's a really good point here, that as we Into the Odd campaign, that maybe we build something longer out of it, maybe these events become more interesting. And I think in Symbaroum there is a parallel. There are a lot of skills in Symbaroum that affect kind of, and a lot of merits and demerits that affect how people feel about you when they first see you. Like there's like an evil eye detriment, that you have a cult-looking birthmark and it makes people kind of want you out of their zone. But I think this goes back to what Sam was saying. We haven't used them. We've not really touched the Symbaroum interaction mechanisms all that much. And I'm not sure that's our fault. Do you think we could be? I don't think Symbaroum lends itself to turning social situations into role-based situations.
I think there's two kind of points of that in Symbaric. One is that if you look at the skills, nearly all of them are to do with combat, or like more or less either directly, sometimes indirectly, but to do with combat or like healing. There are very few, as far as I remember, social skills in Symbaric. Maybe like I can't think of any real social skills in Symbaric. So I do think it's fair to say that it's not like that is not the driving force behind Symbaric. I do also think that perhaps the parts of the campaign that we have played have been less focused on social situations. And maybe when we end up in Indaros or somewhere like that, they might play a bigger role than they have so far in our campaign.
Yeah, there are absolutely places where in the world that are clearly geared towards sort of politics and intrigue. We just haven't been there much yet, but like it's definitely a good point. Like I've got no idea how well the rules hold up in those kind of situations. I suppose maybe the implication there is that is you're reliant on role play alone.
Yeah, I feel that's a good point, because we do have kind of we do have John with his kind of noble character who kind of does dig us out, and we do have Anton as well coming along, and I feel that a lot of the social interactions are based a lot on role play. I think some of them are based around blue access key opens blue door, in that if you have a theurg in your party and you go and speak to the head theurg, you're going to have more options with how to progress along that train than you do otherwise. And I think that's actually, I feel that's a little bit limiting, and I kind of prefer Into the Odds approach. And I feel like what we're dealing with here is stacks of systemic complexity. And I feel like, as Sam has pointed out, there's a lot of systemic complexity in the combat in Symbaroum. A lot of the skills are focused on how you behave in combat. And what Into the Odd has done is not increase the social complexity. Into the Odd has simply not implemented the combat systemic complexity. And we're left with something that's much more level in terms of a social situation and a combat situation. Will not play out the same, but have I maybe have the same number of pages devoted to them in terms of the rulebook.
A closer number of roles for sure when you're when you're doing them.
Yeah, I think there's some like interesting kind of number crunching that you can do around like how the skills play out in both games, right? Because on the surface, both of these things are the same. You are roll a d20, not 2d6, Chris, below a certain value, right? But those values, so for instance, like how like your skill values are distributed is very different. Like 3d6 to roll for a stat Into the Odd is going to give you a bell curve of probabilities that is quite heavily centered around 10, 11, 10 and a half. Yeah, because of the way that dice work and what happens when you roll 3d6 and what the probability curve is there. Whereas I forget the specific system for Symbaroum, but I know that like the basic version of it is that you have a list of numbers ranging from 7 up to 18 or something. It's quite a wide list, and you assign those to various skills. I think what that does is lends its so you get to choose those in Symbaroum, whereas so you get to more with more intention, kind of craft a character rather than just like you get what the dice tell you get, which is fun too, but a different kind of fun. But yeah, so you kind of you have a concept, you skew your skill levels towards specializing in those kind of things. You buy up your abilities to match, and then presumably it's on the GM to provide challenges of a sufficient difficulty level that you really have to kind of work to your advantages, and so I think just from how you generate the numbers you have to roll less than at the start of the game lead to very different places in gameplay, in terms of skill distribution and in terms of teamwork, and in terms of this interchangeability of like this feeling of interchangeability of characters and Into the Odd. That's before you've even got into like the relative complexity of the combat itself. That's just any skill. So yes,
I also think something that's really nice about Into the Odd, that's almost a bit of a hidden system, is the fact that your stats rolls, the overall proficiency of your stat rolls decides what your starting loadout is. And I believe there is a bit of a balance in that a character who rolls terrible ends up getting a very good starting loadout.
I love that.
And inverse as well.
Yeah,
that's true. Although it's only based on your highest roll. Is that right? Am I making that up?
Yeah, it's your highest roll cross-referenced with the number of hit points you have, which is just like 1d6 that you roll.
See, I mean, it does balance out a bit, but you could still have, like, if you roll all three high, all three of your stats high, it doesn't really account for that. And if you roll like 1 high and 2 really low, it also doesn't really account for that. To me, I think I don't mind Into the Odds, but I think what I would dislike is having a character that had all mediocre stats. And I think like that can be sort of, I think if you got that, you might be compensated with something else in the character creation and Arcana or something. But I think having all mediocre stats, it's a hard character to play and make interesting in my.
And because of the bell curve, it's also the most likely outcome.
Yeah. Elroth's deeply mediocre.
Yeah.
He got actually, is it the highest? I need to check. It might be the lowest. It might be what's your lowest stat.
Oh, it could be.
Because Helroth, his strength 11, a little bit above average, Dex 9, a little bit below, willpower 6, like pretty bad. And hit points 3, which is a bit below the average for 1d6. But he's the only character that started with an Arcanum, so I think the table, bestowed that gift on him for being otherwise a deeply ridiculous and mediocre person.
Yeah. I feel like I do kind of, I love and I hate the character generation and the kind of random nature of the character generation. I hated it when I started, and I loved it by the time we got like one or two sessions in. And I feel go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I don't know. I've just totally jumped in to your point. But like, so for me, the reason that I love the character creation so much for Into the Odd, like I'd hate it in Symbaroum, but like for Into the Odd, is that it's one of these things where I'm talking about these kind of hints that can be in a rule book about a particular playstyle. It takes you 5 minutes to roll a character, no thought. And that makes characters very cheap, which makes them which pushes you towards a certain gung-ho attitude in your playstyle, because it matters way less than a game where you've got to like really think of a character concept, spend basically a session putting it together.
I think as well as the fact that it's so quick, the fact that it's not just quick on the stats, it gives you the backstory. I think if you have to come up with your own backstory, or like you're invested in it immediately because it's something that you've thought up and like that you've had to come up with yourself. If you're just given a backstory, you can still be the character can be even more interesting than whatever terrible backstory I've thought up, but I'm less invested in them as a character, having just been given your character is like this, as opposed to something I've thought of myself.
Absolute classic, the attractive dullard. I think it's those cues that really take your character from a almost an imposition. It's like, oh, I have no creative import into this, into turning it into almost a joyous exercise in chaos, and you get to kind of get a fun prompt like that to go off on one. I think is really, really pleasant.
It's worth being clear that we've kind of house ruled this a bit as well, right? Like the actual minimum requirement is you roll strength, dex, willpower, hit points, and look up on the table for starting equipment. The rest of it, in theory, you can make up yourself. Like you can name the character, you can decide what they're like, you can give them a backstory. Like we only chose to generate those from tables because the tables were there. There's nothing in the rulebook that says that you have to do it, but I have enjoyed doing it that way. But like if you don't, I don't think you have to.
It's been
another thing where in a
good.
longer camp, in a longer in a longer campaign, you might want to do more of it yourself. And in a shorter campaign, it might be better to just what you're given.
I feel like maybe Into the Odd might suffer on a longer campaign, but I feel like we speak from a tremendously cloistered position, and that the only game we have recently played for any extended amount of time is Symbaroum, and I feel like Symbaroum's late game happens in its mid game, and everyone's just left pushing unspent experience points around a character sheet for a number of months, because I know that's what I've been doing recently.
Yeah, the power curve is totally weird in Symbaroum, considering how much more campaign there is left and how difficult I know Matt's already finding it to like tune encounters, and like we're at about the level that we're supposed to be, I think. But yeah, it's like I don't know. It's difficult for the purposes of this conversation to compare that to the power curve and Into the Odd, though, because we haven't even started that.
Like, 42 and Steve both raised great points here. So a lot of what's happening in Into the Odd is an improv prompt, and like it's there's so many good prompts in the actual book there. And I feel like this really kind of looping back to our earlier point, that it does feel like Into the Odd is an exceptionally beautifully crafted engine for telling kind of abstract stories in this infinite and kind of socially empty maybe space. And Symbaroum is it feels like a much more denser one as well. I feel like I kind of wanted to start thinking about wrapping up, and just wondered kind of, I don't know. Well, let's just answer the question. Everyone came here to answer. Steve, which one's better, Into the Odd or Symbaroum?
That's not fair.
It's not fair, but it's necessary.
I can see myself having a good time, for some values of good time with Symbaroum for longer than Into the Odd. But I've really appreciated Into the Odd as a palate cleanser.
I think does Matt have the phrase kind of beer and pretzels role playing games? I think Into the Odd is more kind of like cheapish bottle of Tesco wine and hummus, kind of one night's round the house role playing game, kind of situation. I feel like it's got much more of that.
It's closer to a one. Sorry, it's closer to like a 1-page, one shot that you might.
It's got that feeling, doesn't it? But it also has replayability. Whereas Symbaroum, you go through these big, beautifully crafted environments and beautifully crafted set pieces, and then you put them away, and you kind of look at them for nostalgic value. But I don't feel like you're going to run them again, especially not for the same group.
Yeah, for a different group. But I do think there's still, like, we could do this whole campaign, and I think I'd still be happy to play more Symbaroum of just whatever Matt wants to cook up as whatever is in Davaka. Because we played that. Me and you, Chris, played did Steven play that? The spin-off we did?
Yes, the chains of sadness.
Yeah. So something like that, close enough. That
Fetters of Stone, thank you. God, professional role-playing channel.
Chains of Sadness is the sequel coming up soon on Telling Tales. But that was just something that Matt came up with, and it's like it fits within the lore, but it's just something he cooked up and still felt very. I mean, Symbaroum is on Matt's kind of wheelhouse of
Yeah,
tonally.
I also
think,
feel like we can't undersell Matt's talent as a
Mm.
narrative designer. He's very good at kind of there's like we're running the Throne of Thorns and we're running the Copper Crown, but there's a lot of his kind of touches and his kind of diversions put in there, which is the mark of a good GM. But I think the mark of a great GM is I can't tell the difference between stuff that's been printed and stuff that he's kind of woven into it.
Yeah.
And Feathers of Stone, you're right. It just sat perfectly in that world, and it sat there, which I suppose goes back to your earlier points that it's like Symbaroum is not anathema to homebrew. You just have to be a little bit more careful.
Yeah, more conscious of the law because there is law, as opposed to the odd where there simply is.
Or there, I suppose, there is dynamic lore rather than kind of Into the Odds big wall of mystery. That's kind of a static big wall of mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
So I suppose one of the things I wanted to kind of wind up on for my own final thoughts was obviously we've talked a lot about kind of the differences in which system does story in a particular way, and Symbaroum's kind of close and dense story versus Into the Odds kind of empty story. And there was kind of, if not consensus, then a lot of agreement with the fact that the story in Symbaroum is real good. But kind of counter to the point, if the story and setting in Symbaroum is so good, then why the fucking hell does my spear not have a good enough backstory? I hope you're watching, Matt. I hope you're bloody watching.
He's just kicking back with a hazelnut yogurt.
Oh, I loathe to end on an in joke, but I think that was a good enough setup there. So I suppose that anyone else want to have any more serious kind of final chats? I feel like I have, obviously Symbaroum is an investment of years, and Into the Odd has just been kind of a delight for a fortnight. But I feel like I've thoroughly enjoyed my time in both.
Yeah, for sure. I wish I wish we could play both of these campaigns at the same time. This has really made me miss Symbaroum, but also made me wish we were going to play more of Into the Odds after we're done. I don't know. I just want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely on the table for one shots, and especially because it is just so rules light. It's kind of like definitely can go in the big chest of break glass for emergency one shots.
Yeah, you can get that to the table really easily. Like if you're asking for summary thoughts, Chris, like I guess the way that I think about it is that like, yeah, we have just spent a bunch of time comparing apples and oranges. I think it's even though they're very, very different systems, I think that can be a useful lens to look at both of the systems, you know, from the point of view of the other one, and just to spend some time thinking about what makes those games tick and what makes them kind of interesting. And if we've achieved nothing else, we've managed about an hour and a half of reasonable content.
Yeah, and that was the real friends we made along the way. So, and anything from you, Sam?
I think for me, I'd say that Symbaroum is more what I tend to prefer as a role-playing game, in that I really love the story and setting in role-playing games. For me, it's a huge part of what makes them interesting, and I love to read through the books to learn about the worlds in role-playing games. But having said that, I am really enjoying Into the Odds. I think maybe as well, like that comparing these has made me realize things about these systems that I otherwise wouldn't have, and maybe it might not serve as the best, like, which should you play, but it might still be useful for kind of understanding each system individually, to compare even very kind of wildly different systems like this.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll open it up for anyone in chat who wants to kind of ask any or kind of bring any interesting points at the end. We'll have a couple of minutes to chalk through those. So throw them in now if you got them. I am going to do the kind of terminal promo, as is the long-standing tradition. Thank you very much for watching. This is one of a scattering of non-actual play content we do on the channel. The rest of it you can find on our YouTube. Links down there in the description. Or in the channel information panel. Once again, we've got Mondays is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay right now. Wednesdays is next week will be the finale of our pass through the Iron Coral, the Into the Odd in-book taster adventure, example adventure. And then Thursdays we have just finished up our Wraith segment of Cincinnati Chronicles and are all looking forward to the much more lighthearted and surely not harrowing experience of Changeling. And that's kind of where we're at the minute. Next one shot is still a little bit up in the air, so more announcements on that to follow on our socials and subsequent streams, but it will be August, early-ish August sometime, I believe. And yeah. So let's see if we've got anything. Yeah, so maybe the next one shot's going to be a random spear backstory workshop. Or maybe we should work on developing a randomly generated spear backstory table.
We need a spear table. Yes.
I want Matt to have one, and so every time you ask, he just gives you a completely different
answer. Oh, that's almost as good as my favorite bit from the start of Into the Odd was setting up a different name every time anyone asked me my name.
Yeah.
Yeah. So poor old Steve, Harry, our primary content designer. So let's look at this one from 42. So yeah, how do we? At what point, actually, this is kind of a jump off question. At what point into the Odd did you realize we were going full Python?
I think very early, immediately, really. When I arrived, I'm pretty sure when Tiva, or when one character arrived at the town, one of the guards of the town was dead, like on duty and dead. I think at that point I was like, okay, I see how this is going to be.
It's gonna get odd. So I made a conscious choice with Hellroth. I think going full Python is a good way of putting it. It's a thing that I discovered many years ago. If you are playing a character who you're basically trying to get killed, it can often be surprisingly hard to do so, but you can have a lot of fun along the way.
Such a good point.
And having spent so long being so cautious with Alindra in Symbaroum, I was like, I do not care if Hellroth lives or dies. I just want him to throw himself into the story. And so that kind of idiot fearlessness was baked in for the start for me. I didn't know to what extent the rest of the party would sort of follow along, but I kind of like that even when he wasn't about, encounters were always starting the same way. Morning.
Yeah. I think that's almost meme tier material. In fact, if we could ever get around to getting more emotes done, that should probably easily be one we should throw up.
I wonder, is 42's question to do with, like, as you're creating a character and other players input into their sort of background as you're creating them? Is that the
yeah, and I feel like we don't really do that here. The one time we did do that was the Dungeon World one shot, and it turned out so well because everyone generated their characters on stream, and we built just a really good synergy. Everyone came with their own characters, but as the theme of the troop was beginning to emerge, everyone kind of adjusted their styles to begin to synergize with this ridiculous concept. I would recommend going back and watching that one shot. I think all of the characters involved in it are actually very close to the hearts of our one shot team. We all kind of generate our characters in isolation most of the time, don't we?
The one thing I can think of is in Coriolis, because you have like relationships between the characters. So at least for me and Mike, we did a bit of sort of groupthink backstory generation, as you know, where since we knew each other before, how did we know each other? Where did we come from? How did our characters' relationship start and develop before the game? And I really enjoyed that. I think it's nice to have kind of input from other players before you even get going.
Yeah, I think having some preconceived sense of relationships and interactions can be great. Like it's by no means necessary, but I think when those things are considered, it can really kind of elevate a game.
I think definitely one of the things I've realized as I've got older and been role playing for a longer period of time is it's kind of one of the problems we always had when we were starting off games, usually D&D in a tavern, and it was just being a young person, I did not really want to socialize, and most of the people in my group of nerds were the same. So it was a lot of very edgy characters with very tragic backstories sitting in a room not talking to each other. Now we're older, and I suppose now we're in a situation where we're performing and playing when we're streaming. It's a lot more, we realize it's our responsibility to get these characters, once they do set off, to get them together as quickly and as seamlessly as possible. Because it is, going back to something Steve said earlier, 100% collaborative storytelling. It's not about kind of, well, at least in the systems we play. I know in Vampire, there's almost a built-in PvP element of the kind of double crossing and conniving and power play, which, if not systemically realized, is definitely in the meta text. But for us, everyone's duty is to be friends as quickly as possible.
I mean, PvP in games like Vampire is still collaborative storytelling. Collaborative storytelling doesn't imply that your characters all have to be friends. It just has to imply that as players, you're coming into this to craft a narrative together rather than to win.
But yeah, that's about it for the questions. So thank you both very much for joining me this evening. I hope everyone watching, indeed everyone who's turned up to our latest experiment in non-actual play content, has enjoyed it. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do drop a like, comment with your favorite kind of green vegetable, and we will see you next week, and hope you have a lovely time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.